Ready? Okay, everyone, we wanted to give a little extra time because the engineering building and the humanities folks may or may not know where we are, but I want to welcome you. My name is Sean Adams. I'm the acting director for the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere, and I'd like to remind you all that this is the final talk in our series entitled Civil Society on the Future Prospects of Meaningful Dialogue. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. The first three of these talks, if y'all were with us, dealt with social fragmentation. This talk was originally planned to be the first one in the second half of the series that was going to address how to open new spaces for dialogue. We're pleased, anyways, to have our distinguished speaker cap off our speaker series and talk about how we can open new lines of dialogue. So we fragmented and then we put back together. I want to announce, and this is the first kind of public rollout of this, that the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere will be engaged in a different and new speaker series for the academic year of 2014-2015. And the title of that is going to be The Work of the Humanities, Critical Thinking in Life and Labor. And we are currently gathering our speakers together. We're about half full. We're very, very excited about it. So if you will check out the Center's website, we will put news about that speaker series for next year as soon as it is available. It's my honor to actually thank also our generous co-sponsors tonight, the UF's Matters Libraries, the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Endowment for Florida Archaeology, UF's Honors Program, the Department of History, the Department of English, the Sam Proctor Oral History Program, and UF's Office of Sustainability. Now, these sponsors make the series work. I think it's been a very successful one, and we'd like to thank them and express our gratitude that they could be part of this collaborative venture. It's also my pleasure to thank, and I'm a little sad that this is the last time I'll get to thank our excellent staff at the Center, the Associate Director, Dr. Sophia Akerd, our assistants, Meg Leroy, Sarah Harms, for their work in making this talk possible. Phoebe Wilson at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences also helped with the publicity. We'd like to invite you to join the discussion by reserving your questions for the end of the talk, which will, the formal part of the talk will be for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. If you must live tweet, we ask that you use the hashtag UF Civil Society, and that's in one word. And my mention of electric and digital, the digital world right now is your opportunity to please silence or turn off all cell phones so that we don't get any alarms or anything going off during the talk. Okay, so the issue of climate change is certainly an issue that lends itself to the social fragmentation that characterized the first half of our speaker series this year. In terms of civil society and rebuilding it, the problem of climate change is one that affects us all at the same time, that it divides many of us. And the consequences are dire, we all know, and yet the political conflict over climate change's timing, effect, and causes makes collective responsibility for addressing it a very elusive concept. Is there any way to reconcile the cacophony of opinions about climate change? Is there a way of reconciling the different ways of producing economic knowledge? Can collaboration and collective responsibility arise from diverse approaches to the environment? Now, it's lucky for you that I am not going to try to address these really thorny questions. Instead, we have brought in a talented philosopher who will tackle these and other questions tonight. So I am going to get out of the way and introduce them to you. Kyle Whyte is assistant professor of philosophy at Michigan State University and an affiliated faculty for the Environmental Science and Policy, the Center for Regional Food Systems, Peace and Justice Studies, Animal Studies, and American Indian Studies. Dr. Whyte writes on environmental justice, the philosophy of technology, and American Indian philosophy. His research has been published in a number of academic journals, has been funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Science Foundation, and the Spencer Foundation. Dr. Whyte is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, Shawnee, Oklahoma. And in East Lansing, he is a member of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition and a steering committee member of the Public Philosophy Network and the the Public Philosophy Network and Conference, and the Western Cluster of the Networking, the Global Humanities Initiative, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation. He was a member of the American Philosophical Association's Committee on Public Philosophy and a 2009 winner of the K. Patricia Cross Futures Leaders Award from the Association of American Colleges and Universities. So without further delay then, let me introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Kyle Whyte, who is speaking on bridging indigenous and scientific knowledges, multicultural solutions for climate change research. And I need to mic him up. He's going to be our eminently mic'd philosopher tonight. Okay. So.
You can see the problem I'm facing, right? When I try to hook up the microphone, I know. So sometimes you have to sacrifice fashion for not being able to use a microphone. Have you guys seen a lot of speakers using two microphones? Yeah. Actually, the thing that's bothering me most right now about using two microphones is it's weighing down my shorts. So by the end of the talk, you might see, that I have pants on instead. Which is actually better than the usual fear I have, because the usual fear I have when I wear jeans with high tops is that when I walk out, the back of the jeans will be sticking into the high tops, right? But then the other leg will be straight going down. So I don't know which fear is better to have, but it's good to be here hanging out with you guys. I'm going to tell you some details about the work that I do on climate change. And I wanted to start off actually by telling you all about why I'm so interested in climate change. Like in the introduction, they were mentioning that I'm a tribal member of Citizen Potawatomi Nation. You guys here in Florida heard of Potawatomi? You have? You know something about it? Yep. A little bit. I actually, one time I was in a part of Michigan where the Potawatomi are originally from, and I asked an audience of like 60 people, if you guys heard of Potawatomi? And they're like, no. Potawatomi, what's that? It's actually good that you folks in Florida know exactly what I'm talking about. So why are Potawatomi people interested in climate change in general? And part of that was in the introduction, is I'm enrolled in the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma. And if you know anything about Potawatomi aren't supposed to be from Oklahoma. They're supposed to be from the Great Lakes region. And that's because my tribe was actually removed in the 19th century and went down to Oklahoma. And that is a kind of climate change, right? You shift from one region to another region, you put yourself in a different ecosystem. And so for a lot of tribes, climate change is an extremely important issue because historically they faced climate change. And so after I got my degree, one of the things that I wanted to do is go back to the Great Lakes region and try to work with other Potawatomi people to deal with climate change issues that they're experiencing in the Great Lakes. Because not all Potawatomis went to Oklahoma, only a fraction of them did, and there's still lots of other Potawatomi folks in the region along with their fellow groups within the Anishinaabe Nation. So climate change is very important to me because it strikes to the core of my identity, and it's a serious concern that I have. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is actually a pretty detailed conversation. I'm an ethicist, so I work primarily on issues of right or wrong, and I typically work on issues when scientists try to work with non-scientists. So kind of get in the mindset that we're going to be having sort of a pretty heavy discussion about scientific research. So the broad topic is kind of sustainability, climate change, but I'm going to look at it in a pretty detailed sense. So I'm going to look at how we do research on climate change. And so I want to give you a few introductory remarks to get you kind of set up. And I'm going to be watching the clock like a hawk here to make sure I can get through a lot of things. This is neither a philosophy talk, it's not a science talk, it's not a American Indian or Indigenous Studies talk. I try to do something that was pretty general because I knew that a lot of you are coming from different places, different disciplines. So first of all, when I'm talking about climate change adaptation, what am I generally talking about? Well, I'm talking about this thing you guys have probably heard about, that recently folks have been noticing that there's a rise in global average temperature. And that rise in global average temperature creates a different climate trend. And that's going to be leading to some changes that a lot of us on the ground are going to be seeing. There might be stronger storms, more droughts.
warmer oceans, rising sea levels, changes in plant life cycles, thawing permafrost. So I wish I had a whole bunch of time to get into the details of what climate change is and the history of the science of climate change. But just for starters, I wanted to mention that this is what I mean by it. So that we're in for change in the environment, and we have to think carefully about how we're going to adapt to them. Now, why is it that climate change is controversial? Well, if you look at any of these things, you can tell that they affect people. If there's more heat waves, what happens when there's a heat wave? I mean, maybe not here in Florida, but at least in Michigan, we got folks in the cities in Detroit, Chicago, they die. There's a heat wave. And normally that would just be considered an accident, but in the current climate change discussion, one of the things is that actually a lot of the changes, the impacts I'm talking about here, they're actually the result of emissions that were produced by the industrial economy or deforestation that was created to support the industrial economy. So humans actually benefited from doing things that some years down the road eventually lead to impacts that people now or in the future have to experience. So there's a sense that climate change is an issue that involves human responsibility. And that's a whole other discussion as well. Now, I focus on Indigenous peoples, and I wanted to give you just a definition of Indigenous peoples so that you kind of knew what I was talking about. So Indigenous people encompassed 370 million folks globally whose communities exercise responsibility of self-governance in accordance with their own cosmologies before an ended or ongoing period of colonization, and who now live within areas where states, such as Australia or Canada, are recognized internationally as the preeminent political authorities in those areas. And so what I really want to highlight about this definition is to call yourself an Indigenous peoples. It means that at some point back in the day, you governed yourself politically as your own sovereign nation, and you did it through your own cultural conceptions of how to govern yourself. And so Indigenous people, post-colonization, sort of now find themselves where they realize, wait a minute, we preceded these governments that, like the United States or Canada, that everybody else thinks are the primary sovereigns. We never consented to their rule or to their domination. But we nonetheless have to live with these bigger neighbors. So if you're looking at a tribe like mine, we've got a little over 20,000 members. We're in the state of Oklahoma, and then we're in the larger United States context. And we have to figure out how to live as groups that see themselves as independent and who see themselves as culturally distinct, but nonetheless you constantly have to deal with these bigger and richer neighbors. And oftentimes neighbors have very different cultures and very different aspirations and different goals. So Indigenous people are trying to attain a kind of autonomy, but they're oftentimes trying to maintain a distinct culture as well. Now, one of the things I want to focus on, and this is just background, but when we're getting into something like climate change, where we're talking about issues of how do you take care of the land, how do you make sure that you're able to deal with climate change impacts, you have to know something about politics. You have to know something about Indigenous people politically. So where I work in the Great Lakes, one of the things to note is that, does anyone know what the red parts are of this? I know you know. Anyone know what the red parts are? Reservations, that you said? Yeah. What did you say? Oh, I thought they were French towns. Well, that's an interesting answer. But yeah, so these are contemporary reservations. And what's a reservation? A reservation is a jurisdiction where an Indigenous people enjoys the highest level of sovereignty. Okay, so that's an area where Indigenous people are as autonomous as possible given the constraints of being in the United States. And then what are these colored areas with the years on them? These are what's that? Land cessions, exactly. Ceded territories, often called treaty areas. So these are areas where the groups here in the red, so Lakota, for example, or Mille Lacs, that they actually ceded this land to the United States. That was originally land that they occupied. They ceded it to the United States. However, one of the things to note that's very, very important is before the coming of the United States, all Indigenous people lived lives very close to the land. They were subsistence lifestyles. And so the entire way of Indigenous governance was based on maintaining very careful relationships with the environment. So for example, in an earlier lunch, I was talking about how tribes in the Great Lakes, like these folks, one of the species they depended on was wild rice. The entire society was built around conserving wild rice, to the point where the fundamental way in which you understood right and wrong, to the fundamental way in which you understood legality, was based on how you treated wild rice. In fact, leadership was oftentimes based on how to, who had the best understanding of how to conserve wild rice. And so the idea was that when they ceded these territories to the United States, they still retained rights within them to continue harvesting things like wild rice, or deer, or other species that were significant to the tribe since time immemorial. So one of the things to note about tribes when you're thinking about something like climate change is that you're dealing with a lot of different political jurisdictions. You've got the red area, which is the reservation, but then you oftentimes have the larger treaty area, where even though that's not an area where tribes enjoy a lot of autonomy, so indigenous people enjoy a lot of autonomy, they nonetheless have rights there to continue land-based lifestyles. And this goes into this kind of cultural difference, because in one of those colored areas, you might have non-native folks that are hunting deer, and they hunt deer for their own purposes. And you have native folks that also hunt deer, and for different purposes. Different spiritual issues, different medicinal plants. So this is one thing I can't go into too much detail on, but I wanted to introduce you to that idea. Now, in my work, one of the things I try to do is present from a native perspective. And what this means to me is that when I talk about something like climate change, I'm primarily concerned first about talking about why climate change is an issue as an indigenous person, as a member of an indigenous peoples, and then sort of move on to talk about climate change for other groups like the United States. And so in my research, one of the things I get to do is hang out with a lot of different indigenous organizations that are trying to understand the implications of climate change for indigenous peoples. So I put a lot of these different logos here, and these are just groups I work with: the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, College of Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group, Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. So these are all organizations, native organizations. They're trying to understand climate change, and some of these groups, or I work closely with them or attend their conferences. I also work with a lot of federal agencies, landscape conservation cooperatives, Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment Centers, and these are all groups that are also trying to understand climate change, but from a U.S. federal government perspective. Now, in all these things that I go to, what are Native people worried about with respect to climate change? So why is climate change an issue that bugs a lot of indigenous peoples? And these are a lot of the things I hear. And these are all pretty serious things to consider. So a lot of indigenous people facing things like sea level rise, they're literally facing the fact that they might have to entirely move their communities to another location. Like literally pack up and move to somewhere new. And so in Alaska, I think there's some 80 different villages that are going to relocate due to climate like sea level rise. And for one group, Kivalina, it's going to cost at least $80 million to make that move. And this is a group of several hundred people, I believe. So a lot of actually indigenous people are concerned they're going to be entirely relocated. This is not something you hear U.S. citizens necessarily talking about. People in the U.S. aren't concerned that the entire United States is going to have to relocate to Europe or to some other part. Another thing people are worried about, which you see common in other areas, is infrastructure and financial damage. One of the tribes I work with has a pretty substantial forestry industry. And the way they do their forestry industry is sustainable. So if you go to their commercial forest, you'll see it looks like no other commercial forest. It's not like those forests that you see in video games or like in Mortal Kombat, if you guys remember that, where it's just like the tree stands and like no, shrubbery or anything like that. Their forest is actually full of life, full of different species, and it's taken them many years to cultivate that forest and actually earn a living off of it. But they're actually worried that with climate change, they're going to not be able to maintain the same composition of species in that forest, and that's actually going to hurt their timber industry. And so a lot of tribes are facing these sort of financial issues that they're concerned about, infrastructure issues. As you can imagine, if you're getting more floods, more damage, that's an issue on your government infrastructure. Another big thing you're seeing people talk about is shifts in habitat and invasive species. So I'll go back to, actually, I think it's Ford again. So imagine if your tribe, your reservation's pretty small, and there's a particular species that you want to harvest. Back to the old example, say it's wild rice, and you don't find a lot of that in your reservation area, and you were harvesting it in your treaty area. But then actually wild rice moves north due to climate change, and you can't access it anymore. You don't have a legal right to, or at least a legal right that the United States will respect. So in that case, people are concerned that species habitat will make it so that the only way to access a culturally, economically significant species for a tribe is going to move into a jurisdiction that tribes are not respected as people who can engage with that species in that area. And that's a significant concern. Tribes in the Northwest are worried about salmon. Tribes in the Southwest are worried about water rights issues having to do with this. And invasive species is something coupled with this as well. A lot of tribes in the Great Lakes make baskets out of something called the black ash tree. And there's an invasive species, the emerald ash borer, that challenges the black ash tree. Now, the emerald ash borer didn't originate with respect to climate change, but climate change might worsen the effects of the emerald ash borer, which means you wouldn't be able to make those baskets. And this is always coupled with cultural, ceremonial, and foods issues. Because, for example, say that you had a basket-making tradition that was based on doing things with your grandparents, with your parents, with your cousins, with your friends. Say you have ceremonies that are based on wild rice. If you can't access those species, or if their quality has changed, then that whole aspect of your life ends. Or you are put under great pressure to change it. So from a tribal perspective, climate change is cultural. Or say there's people in your society, and we'll talk about this probably a little bit later, who you depend on for knowledge of the natural world. So elders that have, as we see in the Great Lakes, who have been in the bush for a long time, know a lot about the natural system. And so if climate change makes it so that their knowledge is invalidated, then they would actually lose that credibility that they have within the tribe. And that is a major shift in the social structure, in the cultural structure. So this is another issue here people talk about. First foods is a key issue related to what I'm talking about as well, because if you can't eat the foods that are traditional to your group, what are the alternatives in the United States oftentimes? The little store, yeah, it's not good, right? Unless you want diabetes. So, these are issues that Native people face. I've heard cases, too, of danger in subsistence lifestyles, actually people up north falling through the ice because things have changed so much. Human distress, changes in knowledge and values, intergenerational disconnection. So, all of these issues are things that Indigenous people are concerned about when they think about climate change. And what I wanted to do is come back to this a little bit and just mention, it went on to the board. Let's see if it didn't kick me off. All right, so that was a 10-second interruption. Does that mean I can take 10 minutes longer? Okay. All right. So put yourself then in the mind of an indigenous group, and you're thinking, okay, we've got these political jurisdictions, we're facing these climate change impacts. All right. How do we do this? What are the political solutions? What are the economic solutions? What are the cultural solutions? So that's kind of the position a lot of folks are in. Don't worry about that one. And guess what? It's not only Indigenous people that are thinking about climate change. It's lots of other people as well. So the groups, the logos I was showing you before, sorry, I promised I wouldn't make folks sick, but I'm shifting back and forth. The folks I was mentioning before, a lot of what they do is try to combine knowledge and figure out what climate change impacts tribes are going to face. And these other groups I'm mentioning as well from other societies right outside the Indigenous world, they're doing the same thing. So internationally, going back to the 1980s, you've got the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they're trying to synthesize, every 4 or 5 years, thousands of different studies of climate change and try to then report out some of the potential climate change impacts that people across the world are in for. So this is one of the major bodies of science on climate change. You've got more regional things. There's an Arctic climate impact assessment I'll talk about a little bit later. And there's many different examples of other regions that have their own climate change impact assessments. The United States itself has its own national climate assessment as well, where they try to synthesize as much data and information as they can find about the climate change impacts that the U.S. is affecting. And even at the municipal level, out where I live, you have cities like Grand Rapids, that the city itself tries to synthesize data about and try to figure out exactly how it's going to respond. So lots of other people are in this game of trying to actually figure out, kind of from a knowledge standpoint, what's going on with respect to climate change. What impacts are we in store for? And it's an issue of planning. It's an issue of how do you prepare for these impacts? How do you respond to climate change? So every group is trying to know climate change impacts, but it's actually not something that you can do alone. And people have different knowledge resources, and that's a critical part of the presentation. So I think now we're shifting out of the introductory material. Are you guys ready? Yeah, you're prepped? Okay. I did a good job giving you the baseline. So if you don't understand from here, just blame it on me. Just take it out on me. All right. So this is kind of really the issue that it comes down to is when you're trying to figure out what the climate change are, it's not something you can do alone. So for example, if you're thinking about something like wild rice in the Great Lakes region, there's a lot of different knowledges that can tell you about whether and how fast wild rice is moving north. There's things like satellite images. There's also the actual knowledge of the people that harvest wild rice and their knowledge going back many years of having done that for generations, right? And each of those gives you a different perspective. For example, take something like ice. You can take aerial photography of ice or look at satellite images, and that can tell you things about the distribution of ice. So there's a number of techniques to understand the thickness of ice. But if you're somebody who lives off of the ice, you have a very different perspective on that. You have different knowledge about it, right? You're concerned more about the quality of ice. In the same way that if you're somebody who harvests wild rice, you're not just concerned about how much wild rice there is or how far north it is, but how the quality of it is changing. And so there's lots of different knowledges that actually come to bear when we're thinking about what are climate change impacts. And none of them is good enough alone, because things that give you a good kind of regional display of what's going on don't actually always tell you the history. And things that tell you the history, right, don't oftentimes give you a broad perspective. So when we're talking about climate change research, it's always about scales, it's always about perspectives, and climate scientists really have to grapple with these issues. This is a big part of being able to do climate science. And another thing I wanted to mention is that all of this knowledge, it's not just knowledge for curiosity, it's knowledge that's supposed to help people plan. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, it actually came about to help policymakers. It's a synthesis of different studies for policymakers to use. Or in the case of the groups I was showing you from tribes, those groups are trying to understand climate change impacts so that tribal governments can respond. It's not just any old knowledge. It's knowledge that's used for how people make plans. All right? Let's skip through these. So I want to cover a couple things relevant to this lecture series. So when I say issue, what I mean is something that's not necessarily easy to grapple with, something that's not easy to deal with, something that's tricky. So why is this a knowledge issue? Well, there's a couple things I wanted to mention. First of all, it's limited evidence. So when you're thinking about this, what are the climate change impacts I'm in for? Well, you can't predict climate change impacts precisely. You can get a lot of knowledge about them, but it's not like something that you can predict precisely. And because there's a lot of different perspectives, oftentimes different sources of data on climate change disagree with each other, okay? And so not all knowledges are created equal, and they don't always agree with each other. There's limited funds. As you guys know, the United States, for example, supports certain kinds of climate change research. It doesn't support all of it. Tribal governments support research, but that are big enough to support everything they want to do. So it's a limited funding issue in terms of what society decides to pay for. It's also limited time. I mean, climate change is happening now. Groups are facing it now. So we can't do everything we want over the course of 200 years to plan for problems that we're facing today. If there's research that's relevant for a tribe up north that's relocating, they need a lot of information now. They can't wait. So there's limited time, and whenever you're getting into situations where there's limited, oftentimes competing perspectives, there's not enough money, and there's not enough time, right, you get some controversy. You get an issue. So this is why, in a lot of ways, I describe it as a knowledge issue. Why is it a public issue? And the funny thing here is that when I go to other countries, Canada, basically. Indigenous issues are major issues. They're in the news. But here in the United States, they're not things you see in the New York Times or even in the major newspapers in a particular state. So they're not always considered public issues. But from an Indigenous perspective, they are a public issue. Because for climate change, like I was saying, there are issues that are cross-boundary. So if climate change moves a species off reservation or off treaty area, you've got to work with another society. Or to get adequate knowledge of climate change, you've got to work with a scientist that's funded by the United States. So they're cross-boundary issues. You can't just talk about climate change in terms of one tribe or one country. It includes everybody. And then you get into some of the factors leading to climate change, such as emissions, and you even see more why it's a cross-boundary issue. If somebody in some other part of the planet's emissions mix up in the atmosphere and eventually down the road lead to your lifestyle having to face different challenges, well, that's a cross-boundary issue. So they're public issues because they are issues that involve more than one group, more than one polity, more than one jurisdiction. They're also win-lose issues. Which is another reason why I call them public issues. So for example, if a tribe funds science for one species but not for another species, then the people that are interested in the other species don't get to have adequate knowledge of how to adapt to climate change with respect to that species. Or if the United States, for example, chooses to fund certain kinds of atmospheric research and not others, or it prioritizes some other area of research having nothing to do with climate change, then there's some people that lose from that, right? There's some people whose research doesn't get funded. There's some people who need planning information. They don't get it. So they're win-lose situations, depending on what we do. And then there's the issue of responsibility that all these different groups that I'm talking about, tribes, state governments, cities, they're all connected. So what each one does impacts the other. And then why is it a dialogue issue? Well, when folks get together to try to synthesize their knowledge of climate change, okay, they're not all the same. There are differences in culture, differences in interpretation, and differences in power. So if you get a group of scientists working with a group of scientists or elders or other people from a tribe, they get together to talk about, well, how do we learn about climate change? Not all people are coming from the same place. And so you get these kind of issues that occur when you have dialogue across people who might be more powerful or less powerful than each other, by people who have different sources of knowledge, by people who interpret the implications of research in very different ways. So these are why it's an issue. Okay? Is this all making sense so far? Not bad? Would you tell me if it wasn't? She's like, no, start over. I'd actually like to see somebody do that. Just be like, raise their hand and be like, actually, could you start over from the beginning? I'd do it. So now here's where a lot of the work that I work on, this is kind of where it comes in. So when people then began to have conversations of how is it that Indigenous people, and I'm going to really focus on climate scientists, so scientific organizations that weren't rooted in Indigenous people, but were rooted in international groups and in nation states like the US. When they started coming together to try to work with each other to really understand what are the climate change impacts that we're in for. Okay, so when they came together, started talking about what their different climate knowledges were, it wasn't such an easy conversation, actually. It turned out that they really thought quite differently about what it meant to have knowledge of climate change. And so let me give you some examples of this from interactions specifically with climate scientists and Indigenous people. And when I refer to climate science, I have a pretty broad definition. I mean, climate science involves a number of different scientists that try to understand climate change. And some people use, technologies like weather stations, and other people are more on the social science end and do interviews. Even ethnography can be part of climate science. So climate science just refers to a number of approaches in which people try to understand climate change. And oftentimes these institutions are called climate science institutions, like the climate science centers by the U.S. Geological Survey, for example. So what happened when climate scientists and indigenous people started talking about things? Well, it turned out they were really meaning different things. So, consider the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. So these are studies that involve climate scientists. And they were really thinking that actually indigenous people, the main thing indigenous people contribute to climate change is they have really local observations. So, indigenous people can tell you things like, is the quality of water changing or the amount of water changing in a way that oftentimes the tools of climate science, like a weather station or something like that, can't tell you, or that aerial photography can't tell you. And so, these studies sort of suggest that indigenous knowledge is really just kind of a set of observations. It's things that somebody that lived in a place for a long time, that they would know about that place. But it's certainly different from climate science, which looks at things like global trends and looks at entire regions and uses different technologies to understand climate change. And then if you skip down a little bit, it turned out that indigenous peoples were kind of insulted by that. And they were like, let me shift down. So, let me go down to these. Yeah, so like in the Mystic Lake Declaration, they're like, wait a minute, indigenous knowledge is not just about, it's not just about observations of landscape change. Indigenous knowledge is the knowledge that Native people have from having to adapt to environmental change for hundreds of years, since time immemorial. Okay? It's far more than just observations that science. It's an entire, it's an entire way of living. It's an entire understanding of what it means to be a sustainable society. And that actually climate science is something that could fit into indigenous peoples' knowledge systems. Okay? And so you immediately got these differences that came out in these different fora in which people were trying to link climate science and indigenous knowledge. And this produced actually a critical literature. So lots of people started publishing articles that were critical of how climate scientists were using terms like indigenous knowledge, or traditional ecological knowledge, or indigenous knowledge of climate change. So you produced all of this critical literature. And what I wanted to do is shift to telling you a little bit more about why it is that there was all this criticism of climate science. Okay, and even climate scientists themselves acknowledge, right? But observations and assessments by indigenous people have remained relatively inaccessible to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, mostly due to language and sociocultural barriers. What does that mean? And so I wanted to, in this presentation, just focus on the indigenous perspective of why it is that there was so much criticism and so much concern about how climate scientists were talking about the of indigenous peoples. And so I think there's another side of this story, right? So I'm not giving you kind of the whole picture because I don't have time to do that. And this is a key issue of dialogue, and so this is kind of the fragmentation issue that folks were talking about. But I need to give you some of this background before I talk about the different solutions that I've been part of as an ethicist. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is thinking for climate scientists, when they started talking about their own understanding of climate change and started talking about how to connect with indigenous peoples, one of the key things that you see missing is how you define knowledge in a collaborative context. It expresses expectations about how each party is to participate in that collaboration. All right? So, for example, imagine that you and I are planning to start a business together. We're going to put our heads together based on the knowledge we have. And I went to business school, and I think that I have knowledge of business. But actually, your knowledge is just gossip. Okay? That's just gossip. If I think that if I define your knowledge as gossip, how much am I going to value you as a business partner? I might value you in some ways, but I'm not going to value you maybe as much as you'd like if I think that all of your knowledge is gossip. Or what if you actually said, you know what, all that stuff you learned in business school, that's just book knowledge. I have experiential knowledge. Well, if that's what you think my knowledge is, that means that you're going to think about me as a collaborator in a different way than if you thought that I had experiential knowledge, okay? And so how you define knowledge says a lot about what you think about other people. So this looks complicated, and it is, but I'm going to break some stuff down, okay? So I want to mention a few things, and just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, and this is a pretty big body of research that I've been part of, and so I'm just going to share some sort of insights from this. But look at some ways in which climate scientists define Indigenous knowledge, and then think about the implications for dialogue. So one way of defining Indigenous knowledge is I call the science policy inputs method. So I'll give you some quotes. This is from a report produced by a set of climate scientists working for UNESCO called Weathering Uncertainty. So talking about Indigenous knowledge, they say, this knowledge contributes to climate science by offering observations and interpretations at a much finer spatial scale, with considerable temporal depth, and by highlighting elements that may not be considered by climate scientists. And let's look at another version of this. The 32nd session of the IPCC in 2010 affirmed, Indigenous or traditional knowledge may prove useful for understanding the potential of certain adaptation strategies. Skip. And in the last year, there has been an increasing realization that the observations and assessments of Indigenous people and marginalized populations provide valuable regional, I never know how to pronounce that, in situ information. What? That's good. That's good? I was tempted to say in situ, or in situ, regional in situ information. Offer regional verification of global scientific models and satellite data sets, and provide the basis for successful adaptation and mitigation strategies. And you look at another definition pretty similar. Indigenous knowledges provide research on climate change with local scale expertise, climate history, research hypotheses, community adaptation, and community-based monitoring. And so one of the things philosophically you see here is contrast this with how Indigenous people working on climate change define their own knowledge. So you remember what I just told you. And so look at this one. So TEK, read that, Indigenous knowledge, involves the relationships between knowledge, people, and all creation, the natural world as well as the spiritual. TEK is viewed, or Indigenous knowledge is viewed, as the process of participating, and they emphasize, a verb, fully and responsibly in such relationships, rather than specifically as the knowledge gained from such experiences. For Aboriginal people, Indigenous knowledge is not just about understanding relationships, it is the relationship with creation. Indigenous knowledge is something one does. Look at this one from Dan Wildcat. It seems, with few exceptions, one forgets the knowledges of experience, knowledges gained through attentive living, such as signing and drumming, or singing and drumming. That's signing though, right? Okay. So I read it correctly. I'm mainly concerned about mistakes in reading. So singing and drumming. We need both experimental logic and analysis, so referring to science. Scientific knowledge can also be useful to humankind, but in and of itself, insufficient in generating life-enhancing knowledge for humankind. The necessary and sufficient condition, philosophically imprecise, for life-enhancing knowledges requires paying attention to the life surrounding us, what I call a deep spatial experiential body of knowledge complemented by scientific information and knowledge. And so here, right, you get another expression of Indigenous knowledge, which is a whole lot more than just observations of changing sea ice or observations of wild rice levels. So what's going on here? Why is it that one group is seeing it as one thing, and these other folks are actually saying this is the relevant way in which you define Indigenous knowledge? And I can't get too much into kind of the overall ideas, but what I wanted to mention is this, is that if this is what you think that knowledge means, or this is what you think that knowledge means, when somebody tells you that your knowledge is a lot less than what you think it is, then it raises some questions, right? Because if you see your knowledge as action-oriented, if you see your knowledge as part of the collectivity that you're part of, and somebody else is calling it or a body or an archive, it means that they think that they could actually take that knowledge from you and use it for a different purpose. Okay? And one of the things about the climate science work that I was studying is that climate scientists weren't taking into consideration that if you take knowledge from somebody else and use it, and all you do is talk about how much it will benefit climate science, and you never talk about the risks to that person, then is that a very ethical way to relate to somebody else? If you say, I want something of yours, I'm going to tell you what the benefits are, but let's not talk about risks. And one of the interesting things here, right, is that a lot of climate scientists really didn't think that somebody's knowledge of climate change would bear risks. But think about some of the scenarios that a lot of tribes are concerned about, right? So if your knowledge, if you're a harvester living in a indigenous territory, if you're a harvester and that gives you knowledge of the land and you have knowledge going back a long time, then that means that if you tell a climate scientist about what you know about that area, then they learn about very significant things about what you do. They learned where certain species might be distributed. They learn about certain sacred places. But once you divulge that information to a climate scientist, that information could go public. That information could enter the public sphere. And then people who you wouldn't want to know that information could then use it against you. So for example, if they found out that there was a really nice place that you see as sacred, they might want to use it for recreation. So one of the issues that actually we get in this respect, is that for tribes, or indigenous people, they were seeing their own knowledge as governance knowledge. It was knowledge that they used to take action to live. It was knowledge that was part of how their own society dealt with climate change. But for scientists were mainly concerned with knowledge as just a body or an archive that anybody could just contribute to. And what's interesting is if you see knowledge mainly as an archive, then there's not always that many ethical concerns that come up when you would take an observation or knowledge from somebody else. And things like IRB processes and so on, they oftentimes don't apply to things like somebody's observation of changing sea ice or somebody's observation of changes in water. So one of the main differences you have here is that for a lot of indigenous people, knowledge is talked about in terms of governance, which means that when somebody finds out about your knowledge base, that gives them a kind of power over you. So for example, to illustrate the distinction, have you guys been watching the news about this really unfortunate stuff that happened with Flight 370, Malaysian Flight 370? One of the things that happened there, right, is that different countries didn't want to divulge what they knew about the whereabouts of the plane, right, because they didn't want to show the different capacities that they would have to detect things, okay? So in that case, knowledge there is not, the goal was not, okay, let's just understand as much as we can about where the plane is. Each of the countries was like, well, wait a minute, if we divulge certain things, then we're actually putting ourselves at risk. And so tribes are actually in a similar situation with climate knowledge, is because it's knowledge that they actually use as part of action. It's knowledge that's part of sustaining their well-being. And this is one of, I think, the most difficult issues to understand with indigenous knowledge, that if you just divulge it for the goals of climate science, then it actually puts you at risk. And so one of the first things that was blocking dialogue was this idea that climate scientists, and you can look at all the documents, I mean, I challenge you to look at any of it, any climate science document, do they talk about the risks to indigenous people? And do they understand that for indigenous people, climate knowledge is a governance issue, not just understanding of the climate change system? I want to skip and show you a few other things as well. They're similar. There's other definitions that I've been looking at too. So for example, let's look at this one. Although the Arctic climate change, this is from the Arctic Climate Assessment, although the Arctic climate has always undergone change, Current and projected changes make it timely and important to reflect on the ways that such changes affect Arctic residents, particularly the indigenous residents whose way of life is so closely linked to their surroundings. It's also important to consider how these indigenous residents observe and feel about the changes that are occurring. Together, such perspectives can help the global community understand what is at stake in the changing Arctic. So here, it's silent, interestingly, on how indigenous people, I didn't just trip, on how indigenous people fit in the global community. What's the relationship between indigenous people and the global community? And for indigenous people, they're oftentimes very concerned. One, they're not considered sovereigns in the United Nations. And two, they're oftentimes extremely oppressed by the nation states that they live under. Indigenous people in the US certainly are not pleased with all of the ins and outs of their relationship with the United States, both historically and contemporaneously. So when it says something like, we'd like your knowledge because of its benefit to the global community, well, they should say something to you about how you think you fit into the global community. And oftentimes what you see is that the assessments that are produced, like the Arctic assessment is actually a very good example, I think, of a pretty good collaboration between indigenous people. So I'm not actually talking about these in sort of a critical sense, but I'm more using how people talk about to raise why people have been concerned, or at least my ideas about why people have been concerned. But there's no understanding, and think back to earlier stuff I said, about the way in which they brought together the different scientific sources would actually be used by an indigenous government, or by indigenous leadership, or by people in an indigenous culture, elders, people that are responsible for environmental stewardship. There was actually not a lot of sense there in terms of, is the product of bringing all this together something that actually could be used by indigenous people? So indigenous people actually were not considered to be political actors in the global sphere. And there was not a lot of attempt to ensure that the actual product was one that they could feasibly use as political actors. So this is another issue that you see when terms like this are being used. So to give you an idea, then, language is very important because how you define knowledge says a lot about what you think the other participant is, right? In the first case I showed you, when knowledge was defined primarily as observations, it gave off the assumption that knowledge was archival. If you think that the person you're working with is just an archivalist, it makes it sound like as long as you get the basis for the basics for the archive, then you're done, without talking about risks. Or if you see what you're doing as contributing to the global community, but you don't define how all of the people who would be impacted by the research fit into the global community, and when the global community is something that's been historically oppressive to indigenous people, then what are you communicating? Okay? So these are some of the problems that are actually indicative of a lot of different relationships between climate scientists and indigenous people. And so this is how I explain why there has been kind of a critical literature, is that people haven't taken care about how they define knowledge. And I can give you examples on the other side, right, of how climate scientists feel that they've been defined by indigenous people. So like I said, it's not the whole story. So how are people bridging this? How are people moving on? What are some of the strategies people are using? So let me share some stuff. So one of the main strategies that I'm part of is, and this is how I say that it works, is that people are now realizing that they need to level indigenous people's collaboration with climate science through emphasizing how knowledge is tied to governance and stewardship. And that's an odd thing, actually, for a lot of scientists to grapple with, because think about it. Say that, like in the Flight 370 case, that a tribal group has some information about about climate change, and they don't want to divulge the source of that information because it's governance knowledge, not just knowledge for understanding. And the scientist is like, well, wait a minute, the whole purpose of scientists is if you make a claim, you show me the methodology, right? And so one of the things that we've tried to do, and I'll share with you some of the different things that I've been part of, is create events, create forums where we could actually talk about the relationship between knowledge and governance, which means that not only do tribes get to talk about the role of climate change knowledge and climate science for tribes, and also how tribes can manage their own climate science instead of only being part of climate science efforts funded by others, But we also try to clarify the different ways in which science itself reflects the culture that it comes from. Because it's also a dubious claim that science is sort of the only thing that has a claim on objectivity in some respect, right? And science itself is not wrapped up in a culture. And it's not knocking science to say that. I mean, really, it's not. It's just an actual idea out there, right? That any kind of knowledge activity is going to in some way reflect the culture that came out of it and serve certain purposes. So the multicultural solutions I wanted to talk about in closing then all have to do with how is it that you can create events in which you can talk about something that people take for granted, like the definition of knowledge, and you can redeploy it in a different way that it's been used before. So one of the first projects I was part of is I've been part of a team, and I call this Transformations and Policy Orientation, where we actually created new guidelines for a federal agency. It's under review now, so I can't give you all of the details. I can only tell you what the themes are. But it's under review at a federal agency to try to actually adopt as their policy for collaborating with Indigenous people on climate change knowledge, so aka climate science and Indigenous people. And so in this study, we did a number of different things, right? We were very careful at the beginning, I know this is a little bit tiny, to define all the different things that knowledge can mean, all the different kinds of climate knowledge, to also try to understand what it means for a tribe to actually have Indigenous knowledge, and how tribes can actually control climate science themselves, right? A lot of tribes pay for their own staff that does climate science. So it's not just a case that only climate scientists need to do climate science, but tribes can do it as well. Tribes can house their own climate science organizations. We talked about, I'll skip to a couple of things. We talked about how you always need at the bottom to establish an institutional interface between Indigenous peoples, knowledge holders, and governments for clear, transparent, and culturally appropriate communication. And what we really did in the document is we focused on the fact that when climate scientists work with Indigenous people, it's not just a knowledge exchange, but it's actually a diplomatic relationship, okay? Because it's a group sort of coming forth with knowledge that's important to that community, and it's a matter of diplomacy. And so that's really interesting because most scientists wouldn't think that about what they're doing. When they work with a collaborator, they don't see it as a diplomatic effort. And so what we've done in the guidelines is actually try to use language differently to try to suggest actually that it's not problematic with respect to climate change research to think about diplomacy as the way in which you would work together within a collaborative relationship. Another thing is Indigenous self-determination in action. So Indigenous people, you'll see, and I can send you this if you want me to, just email me, I've got tons of PDFs. But Indigenous people actually, like I've been saying, do their own climate science. And so climate science, not seen that before, should see these cases where Indigenous people are actually housing their own climate science, and what does it look like in those cases. And this also includes research, is that oftentimes you don't have a body of research that says what Indigenous people think about climate science. There's a lot of stuff out there about what climate scientists think about Indigenous knowledge, but I'd like you guys to show me a study where Indigenous people actually expressed what they thought climate science was and what they thought climate science meant. And so one of the studies that I've been part of, and I wanted to show you a few more things before I close. I've been actually part of a study with a bunch of other tribal members where we actually tried to understand from an Indigenous perspective what they thought about things like climate science. We're trying to say what makes a successful collaboration involving science from an Indigenous perspective. And what was interesting, skipping ahead, is that one of the things that we found out is that they thought that climate science could be integrated with like a list of 8 different kinds of Indigenous knowledge. So it wasn't just observations, but they actually say, wait a minute, climate change is valuable, or climate science is valuable when it's mixed up with all of these different kinds of knowledge. So we need to have more research where you actually have Indigenous perspectives on climate science, and that's a key part of the conversation. And then finally, right, one of the things I've been part of is a set of conferences that look at the relationship between climate science and Indigenous peoples as a process of political reconciliation, as a process of reconciliation. So one of them I wanted to talk about is the Shifting Seasons Climate Change Summit, which I'm one of the leads on. It's through Menominee Nation. It's funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And it's a gathering about half people working for tribal governments and half climate scientists from different federal organizations as well as privately funded climate science organizations. And instead of just having them get together and talk about what they know, we're actually going to have all sorts of training and all sorts of dialogue on conversation about how all of the participants see their science as serving different cultural and political goals. And making people think very carefully about how is it that the products of your science, right, how is it that those products actually can be used by different people based on the particular situations that they're in. So what we want to actually get people to talk about is if you're going to do something like a synthesis report, how is it that you could work with Indigenous people so that synthesis report was a significant governance document for them moving forward? So once again, getting people to talk about the role of climate science as a governance activity and being very clear about how Indigenous people are to fit in something like the global community. So once again, having a different conversation of knowledge, not just talking about scientific research methodology, but talking actually about how climate science fits into a larger context. And so I hope that when we have this conference, and I've been part of conferences that did similar things, but I think this will be the biggest one. I'm curious if we'll be able to develop a methodology for moving forward that can be used for further reconciliation processes. So here then it's a reconciliation process because people are really focused on trying to improve the political relationships between the two groups and also reflecting on why those relationships did not work in the past. So these are some of the solutions that I've been exploring, but the key idea is that oftentimes to break up kind of the fragmentation, it's not only about educating people, but it's about actually having conversations where you mix up the different concepts that are oftentimes associated with things that you take for granted, like knowledge. And that's the end.
We have some time, Dr. Whyte has graciously agreed to take any questions, so I will let him follow those.
Gio, yeah.
I just have a question about that. What are the diplomatic requirements for both the Indigenous people and I guess overbearing institutions like the United States and private companies, if any? And then, do you ever foresee those diplomatic requirements fade over future relations?
See them fade?
Like in time. Would they ever need to hold their time in diplomatic relationships, or could it be more
Yeah. Well, so yeah, that's a good question. A good several questions. One of the things that happens is when, say, somebody wants to do some kind of climate research or working with tribes, they just think that they need to get the consent of the individual tribal members that they might be working with. And oftentimes, tribes and other Indigenous people, they don't actually have their own research protocols. So like here at Florida, I imagine you guys have a IRB, right? Yeah. A tribe as a separate government that has agencies and other institutions can have its own IRB protocols, right? That then hold researchers to meet certain ethical standards and other standards as well. So more tribes are developing these things, and one of the important improvements that we're seeing is that more tribes actually have research protocols. So one of the key areas of diplomacy is you're getting actual researchers that become accustomed to working with tribes as separate governments. Because I'd be surprised if, and please prove me wrong, I'd be excited if somebody did. I'm waiting to be proved wrong on this. But most research, especially climate scientists, if they work with a tribal group, say here in the United States, they wouldn't be taught that that's like working with another country. And so one of the gains you're seeing is I'm seeing a lot more climate science researchers that do recognize that and have a whole different set of strategies and knowledge about how to work with tribes in that way. Another thing you're seeing is tribes jointly contributing to research positions. So in Canada, for example, I know somebody who does climate change research who's jointly funded by a First Nations organization and by his university. And so there you have the creation of a hybrid group. Or, for example, I work with a lot of federal agencies that fund tribal climate change research. And oftentimes the scientists and the tribes work together so well and over time that it really becomes kind of its own thing, and a kind of a hybrid. And so I think you do see cases where folks in the US or in other local governments and tribes work so well together and understand each other so much that you wouldn't have to have the kind of overly protective diplomacy that you see in a lot of other cases. And that's actually a tribal methodology for how to work with people. And I know I'm giving you a long answer, but the folks that had lunch with me earlier, you know I give long answers. You asked a lot of stuff in your question, and you're actually drawing on a lot of interesting things that I've been keeping track of, a lot of interesting cases of innovation. And so, but oftentimes the tribal methodology for collaboration is based on building trust, building friendship, building mutual understanding. And one of the things that you see that's really interesting is that in successful programs where tribes work well with, say, federal agencies or state agencies or scientists through organizations, is that every single year, sometimes more than once, they'll have a pretty large public ceremony that all of them design together, which renews the importance of that relationship. And as a scientist, you're definitely not taught that if you collaborate with a tribe or another group, that you're supposed to create an annual ceremony with them. This is not something you're taught, but actually that's what it takes a lot of times. And so there you see a move from an overly protectiveness, right, to much more comfort, which is why oftentimes if, say, somebody working for a federal agency gets a promotion and moves somewhere else, the collaboration collapses. Because somebody new comes in, they might not have that perception. So yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of gains. But the last thing I'll conclude with on your question is that when people don't approach a tribe oftentimes as a diplomatic effort, that it's very hard to get a good collaboration going. The study I just showed you, we interviewed like 50 people who work in the Great Lakes in cooperative tribal natural resource stewardship, and in particular organizations started by tribes. Another thing you find is that in cases where you want to work with a tribe, like I had just seen a research project where they told me that they were interviewing a bunch of tribal members in the Great Lakes Basin about their observations of climate change. And it's funny because all the people they're interviewing consented to it and are going to do the interviews, but they actually, those individuals who are tribal members didn't actually have the permission of the tribe to do that. And especially the people in the tribe that are responsible for natural resource stewardship, like the natural resource departments or the environmental quality departments in those tribes. And there you kind of get this issue that even if the individual agrees to it within a tribal community, does that individual have a right to share knowledge of the community without a kind of collective consent? And so that's also an issue I think people are becoming more aware of. And you're seeing people less inclined to just go along with individual consent as their ticket to collaborating with a tribe. Yeah, good question. Email me if you have more questions on that, because I'm a repository of examples of this. Yes?
So in other words, it tells me like the indigenous knowledge about climate change, DEK, whatever you want to call it, and then science on the other hand, there's this other interpenetration that's really complex and interesting. I wonder if you have put any thought into this. To really tap into like the real value, I think, of TUK is to go deep time, right? And that's maybe the role of archaeology jumps in here. But archaeology is constructed with the same Western discourse and the same Western ontology, generally. So is this another major impasse that we have to like get around in order to really find the full potential of indigenous knowledge? Because I really do believe it's the deep time perspectivism, not only looking back, but the idea that actually the futures can be envisioned far greater than any Western mind could imagine.
Yeah, and so that's I mean, there's another presentation where I get into the details about that particular issue. One of the things that's interesting with respect to that is that I think is that in some of the quotes I showed you earlier about how Native people define their own knowledge, they really emphasize. I think for now this is kind of the easiest way to put it, but they really emphasize when you're learning about something like climate change, you're learning about how climate change is a a simultaneous social, cultural, economic, familial, physical phenomena. And recently, in a lot of climate change research, they're beginning to use concepts like coupled human and natural systems or social ecological systems or things like that. And so I think a lot of Indigenous people think that because for so long they've thought in those sorts of terms. And for so long they've seen how when your social system responds in certain ways to disturbance, that you get certain outcomes, that they really do think that they have a lot to share with groups who don't look at climate change through that kind of complex lens, and who don't think, okay, what's the implication of a change in family structure like 8 or 9 generations out? You hear the 7 generations number a lot, but a lot of people even think further than that. So, or how is it that knowledge networks can be constructed so that, like you're mentioning, deep time, so that significant aspects of what people know can be passed on? And one of the things that is strange is that oftentimes climate scientists say, well, what Indigenous people, what they get is the deep time, but they're only local in scale in how they understand knowledge. And I've oftentimes wanted to actually challenge that, because it is true that Indigenous people are now just recently using things like aerial photography and satellite imagery and things like that. But actually Indigenous people have shared knowledge in regional networks for years that gave people feedback about trends that are broader, right? And Indigenous people can also use the tools of climate scientists without any problem whatsoever. So to suggest that in some way Indigenous knowledge, and there's other slides I could have showed you guys where people say that, oh, Indigenous knowledge is only relevant in its local manifestation, right? But if somebody in a tribe, like a lot of tribes I work with, if they use climate science tools to better understand aspects of change that are valued in their culture, then in a weird sense, that is broad scale. and they're using Indigenous knowledge to support that, right? So yeah, that's, I think I agree with you.
So part of the work that I do is extracting traditional epistemological discourse through critical analysis of language. And I'm wondering if the conversations around esoteric knowledge with ecology are being conducted in English, or are any, I mean, we discussed the situation that the Potawatomis have, but maybe some other Anishinaabe people are having these conversations among elders in their own Anishinaabe language, or is it being guided by English?
No, that's step 2, I think, in terms of the, and that's a really good point. I think that's step 2 for the groups of scientists I work with, because what I would ultimately like to see is actually something where scientists were at an event that was entirely, constructed around Ojibwe, linguistically, right? And there, the scientists would actually have to engage in quite a bit of learning to even come to that, right? I mean, there was an event that I was part of. It was a group of scientists and a group of tribes. And some of the folks in the tribes were like, look, you guys have been coming here for years. You've been in this continent for years. You've never learned our language. You've never tried to learn the language. You've never learned about our stewardship traditions. Never even learned any of this, right? And here we've learned your language. We've learned how to speak it a whole different number of ways. We've catered to you through different policy documents, catered to your legal system. We've literally done everything to try to suit your interests, and you've not done a single thing to cater to our even basic needs. And we were here a long time before you. And that indicates to me actually how far we are in a lot of respects. So my strategy, and I could be wrong about this, is to first begin to expose folks to some of the differences in governance so that they would actually then realize that when tribes say things in English language, like traditional ecological knowledge, a friend of mine named Preston Hardison, who works for the Tulalip tribe, he calls it speaking in pidgin. Because terms like Indigenous knowledge, or like everything I was talking about, that's all pidgin, right? Because the term knowledge in English doesn't refer to anything that anybody refers to in any tribe, right? Like if you're hanging out with your cousins or your uncle or grandparents or whatever, you don't say like, tell me your traditional ecological knowledge or tell me your Indigenous knowledge, right? You don't say that. There's no such term, right? You know, you know, in fact, if you have somebody who's authorized to talk about the knowledge in their community, I bet they'll just go on and never even use terms like knowledge or use it pretty sparingly, right? And so you kind of have to realize that there's a bit of an incommensurability issue going on. So yeah, my ideal would be like down the road, you'd actually have something that you could structure it linguistically, because it's never enough when you're talking with scientists to say, oh, tribal languages are action-based, or tribal languages mix ethical and epistemic. I mean, you can tell somebody that, but they're not going to, they have to confront it in this and struggle with it in the same way that tribes struggle with English language and try to make meaning out of it. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So you said, well, the impression that I got from our presentation was that you work directly with tribal members, so you actually see them face to face. You had to have present verbal conversations with them. So when you initially started, did you ever experience any hostility or weirdness towards you or your group?
No, because I had two advantages. And this is more about how to do, I think, participatory research. Because first of all, when I started doing my work, I was in the Great Lakes area, and since I am Anishinaabe, it wasn't the same thing as if it was like somebody from a Plains tribe or somebody from a non-native person, right? So that doesn't mean it's easy, but it just means that there were things that I was familiar with the customs and how to relate to people. The people I knew, and people know like where I come from. You know what I mean? So it's not like if you're interacting with some researcher and you're like, where is this person from? You'll never find out, right? You'll never know who they are, what their people are. Like in my case, like it's pretty obvious. People know like who my family is, and they can easily find out stuff about me. And it wouldn't be that hard for them to figure it out, right? So that's one thing that's a little bit different for me. Another thing too is I'm in philosophy, and there's like nobody in philosophy who actually is a participatory researcher. I'm like one of the only ones that does sort of actual participatory research. And so whereas fields like you were mentioning, archaeology, have a bad reputation with a lot of tribes, like they just don't even know what I am. I think folks just think I have a PhD and that I can do work for them. And even a couple of my friends that are archaeologists, like I have one guy who's like, in the Great Lakes area, he's pretty much, in double jeopardy, because he's both from a Plains tribe and he's an archaeologist. So he's like, can you come up with me and talk to the Tribal Historic Preservation Office or something like that. So a lot of times people don't really know what I do, but that's oftentimes just led people to not be more suspicious than they would be. But literally, to give you an idea, it took me 5-6 years just to develop relationships that like allow me to do research now. Because when I started doing this work, even though I'm a community member, because I am a university affiliation, I have a different professional status, I think it's ethical that you have to start over, because you are different. And I know community members that abuse their community membership. And so, yeah, so now, I mean, a lot of people are used to me, but also one more thing, and then if you're interested in participatory research, we can talk more, because if you're doing that work yourself in terms of research or you've published on it, because if you're a researcher already, you should give me your advice on it too. But it's very time consuming, and if you encounter somebody who just doesn't trust you, well, it's like of course they wouldn't trust you. I wouldn't trust them if the tables were turned, right? And you just, yeah, so anyways, I'll keep carrying on about it, but yeah, good question. Mm-hmm.
So you said you have a double advantage, and that's because
I have what?
Advantage to advantages.
Yeah.
And that was because you were already from that area and because you belong to the specific different tribe. But from what I know, that a lot of different tribes are very, like, they still bear a lot of hate to people who don't look like similar to them, and so like welcoming them in is a little bit different, because everyone claims, like everyone, I feel like everyone claims, that there's some part of like Cherokee. So like, you didn't even have to prove yourself. Like, you didn't, like if you came to Florida or you went to North Carolina and tried to do that same survey with a different group, do you think you would go the same way?
No, it'd be totally different. Because like I said, because the thing one thing you have to understand is that for so the tribe I'm from is in Oklahoma, but we're actually from the Great Lakes Basin, and it was one group called the Three Fires Confederacy back in the day, and we've actually to a degree kept that identity. So in another presentation I have a map that shows Three Fires people, and it's like literally our nation extends from Oklahoma in the south, like well into Canada. And it used to actually be one lump. It used to be one thing. And it was a different governing system, right? It was more of a family-based one that just made regional consensus decisions at different intervals. But so what happens in that case, right, is that, and I don't know how much you've done in the Great Lakes, but just like in the 19th century, like there's no, like with Anishinaabe people, there's no particular look or things like that. I mean, you know, each tribe has different cultural membership standards and different government membership standards, right? So, like, I'm a member of the federally recognized version of my tribe, and there's other people that are not because their ancestor forgot to get on some roll or something like that, right? But they're considered culturally part of the group, which is, for most people, the more significant thing, despite some of the other stuff. So, for Anishinaabe, it's a close-knit is not the right word, but there's no real, if somebody is a community member and their family ties can be recognized by others, you can't really escape that in a lot of respects. Now, yeah, you're right. If I were to go to the Qualla boundary with the Eastern Band Cherokee, well, that's just like anybody going out there, right? It'd be completely different. Or if I went to North or South Dakota, then yeah, it's completely different. And I do sometimes meet with other people from other groups, and yeah, it's like I don't have that kind of identity. I mean, I was even considering working in different states, and folks are like, well, if you move out of the Great Lakes region, you lose your credibility. You can't, you're not, the community you're in is not there. So yeah, and I was kind of joking about the different advantages, but it is true to a certain extent.
We have time for one more question.
So thank you for your presentation. I appreciate the difference between indigenous and scientific knowledges now, but I'm curious if there are other kinds of knowledges that might exist within largely white, Western, hegemonic United States, nation-state society that might look different than scientific knowledges and maybe kind of like indigenous knowledges. I don't know if it's within faith groups or I don't know where. Are there other bridging knowledges out there?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the million-dollar question for a lot of people because, because it's not just indigenous people that kind of got disrespected. It's all sorts of other groups as well. Or, I mean, take, for example, urban communities. Urban climate change impacts are deeply unresearched in a lot of ways. And people that have been living in different neighborhoods oftentimes have intergenerational knowledge. They oftentimes have knowledge of the urban ecosystem that no scientist could possibly have. And so there is a lot. Now, I mean, I think as for researchers, there is a pretty gargantuan task of trying to come to terms with all of the different relevant knowledges for climate change. For indigenous people, that's just sort of one area. But people oftentimes, one of the big things that indigenous people are concerned about, and part of this goes to your comment, is that they don't want it to be conflated with what oftentimes gets called local knowledge. And so lots of people have local knowledge. So usually that refers to like 1 or 2 generations of knowledge based on having lived in a place for a long time. And that's kind of that observational knowledge I was talking about. And so that's one thing that indigenous people haven't wanted to be associated with, but it is a relevant form of knowledge. And for some people, it can be incredibly empowering. So in hazard management and other areas, for example, I know of cases where local people weren't treated as if they had anything valuable to contribute, and hence they didn't buy into the responses and the solutions. And so there you get an example of another kind of knowledge. It's also tied to social, cultural, other things, right? Because it's part of then how people feel about moving forward.